exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. Tonight, Marija Marić joins our host, Anna Miljački, for our ongoing Conversations on Care series. Anna launched this series in the fall of 2019, a year after founding MIT's Critical Broadcasting Lab, a platform dedicated to engaging critical, curatorial, and broadcasting work. As well as sponsoring this series, the lab's work has been shown and heard to audiences across the world. Of course, in addition to broadcasting, Anna is a historian, critic, curator, and professor of architecture here at MIT, teaching across history, theory, and design. Anna will kick off the conversation by introducing tonight's guest, Marija Marić. Please join me in welcoming Anna and Marija.
All right, so hello MIT. It is a real pleasure to welcome you back to Conversations on Care. As you might know, some of you, we started this series before the pandemic live, and then we went for a while online and on radio to come back with a couple of events. This is really the second live event since the pandemic, and it's really a pleasure to have it and to have you here. I know that we're competing with a trip to a brick factory and Jack Halberstam at Harvard, and that, so thank you for being here, and I hope, that you have fun in, joining the conversation. So as I restart, I want to invoke, or maybe re-invoke, a story by George Saunders, Man with the Megaphone, which is something that I used to refer to every time we started one of these conversations. In this story, he describes a party and a man with a megaphone at that party, whose use of the megaphone begins to rewire the thoughts and feelings of the partygoers, making the party ever more divided and meaner, and those partygoers more and more likely to use the terms and the words repeated by the man with the megaphone. And as they get louder, their statements get simpler, and vice versa, and you get the picture. You might even remember that recent sort of history in America, maybe one that we're going to. But Saunders ends this particular short story with a kind of charge for all of those with megaphones, asking us to mind the precision, humanity, and generosity of the platforms that our microphones enable, and certainly with a charge to mind the volume of those microphones. So in this series, Conversations on Care, this kind of question and caution about broadcasting combines with another concern, a call by Shannon Mattern and other often feminist thinkers to care about the caretakers. So to study care, Mattern says, is care itself. So with that in mind, Conversations on Care invites and collaborates with the stewards of architectural discourse, usually curators, editors, and activists, dedicated to precision, humanity, and generosity of their platforms and the statements they make on those. And with that coda at heart, I would say again, maybe we invited the sisterhood of intellectual instigators to discuss their labor and their love. So it's a really great pleasure for me today to introduce and talk to Marija Marić, whose real estate poetry I first read in an Avery short, and recognizing that her name was coming from my part of the world, I thought I was intrigued, but also I thought the Avery shorts was doing something really well to have the poem in there. And as some of you know, the Critical Broadcasting Lab is currently hosting Marija Marić and her workshop on real estate poetry here. And we will talk about some of that today in the conversation. She is indeed from my part of the world, coming from Novi Sad, and she comes to us via Zurich and Luxembourg. She's an architect, researcher, and curator based in Luxembourg, where she works as a postdoctoral research associate and instructor in the Master of Architecture program at the University of Luxembourg. So last year, on the occasion of Leslie Loco's Venice Biennale, titled The Laboratory of the Future, Marija co-curated the Luxembourg Pavilion with an exhibition that examined the project of space mining, which happens to have some important links to this small European country, Luxembourg. And I hope we will discuss that also today. So I'm giving you the kind of steps of the conversation to some extent. Marija completed her doctoral studies at the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture, GTA, at ETH in Zurich, where her project titled Real Estate Fiction examined the role of real estate communication strategies in the design, mediation, and globalization of the built environment. And as you might be gathering from all of this, Marija's work examines the production of the built environment and the production of urban imaginaries in the context of global capitalism, and by extension, in the context of the global flow of information. So that's my intro of you.
Thank you so much.
And I thought that we would start with real estate poetry, on which we centered this workshop at MIT. And to start there, in part because we did that, but also because I find it a particular mode of caring for architectural discourse. On one end, it does that by the way that really all critical work does. On the other end, it does it much more concretely by caring for the language of architectural dreaming and selling. And so I'm hoping that you can set it up for us a little bit so that we can go into how, the work that in a way sponsored the real estate poetry and how it works, what audiences you imagine for it, etc.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Anna, for the introduction. Thank you, Katie, also for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here with all of you today, and also to join the workshop that you mentioned, which already started in a kind of very exciting way. So to go to your question, I think I will maybe make a kind of a little detour and look into some fragments of my doctoral dissertation research, where actually this work with language somehow also started. So as Anna briefly mentioned in the introduction, I did my PhD research at the GTA Institute at ETH Zurich, where I looked into a kind of an ongoing, at that point, actually still ongoing, large-scale real estate development called Belgrade Waterfront, which was initiated in 2014 between Serbian government and large private property investor, Eagle Hills, based in Abu Dhabi. And this development was just to kind of give a little bit of context, emerging in a moment of a kind of a peak of, let's say, post-socialist transition. In other words, let's say, kind of privatization and commodification of housing and land and urban space in Belgrade. So as a kind of a culminating moment in which the state is not only enabler of real estate property speculation, Belgrade Waterfront appeared as a kind of a project in which the state itself becomes a real estate speculator. And as I was trying to wrap my head around this gigantic new project that was all over media, that was on every possible news section, on street where people were protesting against it, while being based in Zurich and of course traveling to Belgrade, but also looking in a way across the distance, there was one very particular and interesting, let's say, source of knowledge that I detected around this research, and these were advertising narratives. So I kind of, on one side, I looked into, let's say, the stories of politicians and kind of these, let's say, opportunistic dreams of, money making, and then these kind of narratives around big foreign capital coming to Belgrade to kind of pull off, economic crisis through large-scale real estate developments. On the other side, there were, let's say, citizen groups which formed around protesting against this, let's say, kind of corrupted project taking place. And then on the third side, there was this entirely different kind of world of advertising narratives, which somehow weirdly merged stories of smart cities with myths of nation making and live, work, and play developments, and somehow everything that was going on in between. So I decided to do a kind of strange task and to dedicate a lot of time to actually looking into these advertising materials, which somehow very often really kind of exist outside of the scope of architectural analysis. So I read all of the advertisements. I looked into many, many different media. Like, for example, there were, this is just some kind of, let's say, short sneak peek into the imagery that I was also looking at, but also looking into dedicated television shows, which were somehow over a very long period of time. For instance, concretely on the second picture is a show titled Belgrade Waterfront, which was going on for 2.5 years. Every Tuesday, I think, evening, a kind of a very popular time to watch, where the cameraman and the person who was somehow reporting on the show were walking with politicians, architects, through area which was cleansed for the project, talking about the future development that will take place there. So somehow language and media, and concretely here television program, was very instrumental in building the case for the project over time. So kind of normalizing and legitimizing the development itself. So looking into that, I also noticed some very unusual, at that point, from my perspective, very unusual observations that, for instance, media was not somehow succeeding the project, but was actually preceding the project. And even sometimes the what Nedavimo Beograd group, activist group from Belgrade, also noted in their research, sometimes even the project documentation, technical documentation itself, cited, for instance, model that we saw previously or other media references as actual sources on the project. So we could see a kind of a, let's say, inverted logic in which media was not there anymore to represent and, let's say, succeed somehow project development, but was there to kind of be used as a very concrete, very decisive tool for the project making, right? And then kind of drawing from there, I also decided to do some interviews with both agencies and offices who were in charge particularly of the Belgrade Waterfront project, but also other global developments of a similar type, and who described their expertise as real estate storytellers. So I conducted around 20 interviews, conversations with agencies who specialize in real estate storytelling in order to find out what really real estate storytelling is and what does it do somehow to the cities, to actually also learn that for many of these companies, the way they operate is in a way that they are commissioned before architects and urban planners start their work. So to commission to kind of develop media strategy, which is then followed up by planners who come up with spatial proposals based on that media strategy. So to kind of sum up, this research led me to a kind of a conclusion that looking at this project and looking into many other similar developments of that kind, there is a kind of a need to rethink, in a way, research tools that we have to study architecture in cities in order to be able to more productively somehow enter this blurry domain between what we traditionally know as urban landscapes and their mediascapes. So the question really became, how do we study architecture produced in a real estate media complex in which somehow property speculation, architectural production, and media production cannot be separated from each other anymore. And this is where real estate poetry, in a way, started. So I'm kind of just going to, this is actually a realistic model making of Belgrade Waterfront, which also kind of led to this understanding the question whether architectural part of the project should be seen separately from all other media elements that actually constitute the project, such as models, billboards, language elements, even entire buildings which are renovated or built just to promote the project itself. So based on that, real estate poetry came up as a kind of design, in a way, of a device to actually find a way to read this language productively. So I asked myself, how can we look into the language of real estate advertising, not as a kind of invisible, ephemeral, obsolete texts which kind of come and go, are written not to be read, but how do we actually decide to read them and position them and see them as unexpected urban history textbooks, as unexpected sources of fiction and poetry. So what would happen if we would somehow read, and by reading also reappropriate and displace these texts from their usual habitats, like websites, brochures, real estate brochures, into books and journals and other places where we can actually read them as these containers of knowledge that we just mentioned. That's where real estate poetry actually emerged as a tool. I never know how to describe real estate poetry. Is it a curatorial project? Is it a publishing project? I think it kind of sits somewhere in between.
I like the idea of critical poetry.
Exactly. It's a kind of a critical take to unpack somehow developers' imaginaries of cities and profit making somehow through housing and land commodification. But it also is a kind of very ambitious and somehow paradoxical claim of a literary genre, where in a way the design of a genre represents a design of a tool of reappropriation of that language. So
now you have to read it. So
yes, now we can even take a look. I prepared 2 real estate poems. Anna, I know this is your favorite. I would like to ask you if you want to read this one, and I can read the second one.
I'm going to do this for my collective architecture studio and the workshop. Live, work, and play. We work, live, and play. They live, work, and play. For you to live, sleep, work, and play. Your work, live, play life. Can live, work, and play. Can work, live, play, and relax. Will live, work, and play. Vibrant live, work, play environment. Ultimate live, work, play experience. The live, work, play, learn township. Live, work, play, narrative. Live, work, play. Live, work, play. Live, shop, work, play. Live, learn, work, play. Live, play, and chill. To live, work, and play. Work, play, and stay. Eat, meet, and play. Come in, stay, play, enjoy. Integrated live, work, play business. Ultimate live, work, play lifestyle. The live, work, play taken care of. Place to love, work, and socialize. To live, work, play, relax, and stay. To live and work, dream and play. To love, work, and play. To live, work, and play. Contemporary life, work, and play. Urban live, work, play lifestyle. Lock and leave with peace of mind, or stay and work and play.
Amazing. We should make a real estate poetry band, I think, with the kind of music in the background. So this is an example of a real estate poem which practically always works with the existing language. So my strategy with real estate poetry is never to write a single word on my own, but to collage, reread, reappropriate the language which is already there in order to read it in another way. So for instance, when we look into live, work, and play, I think all of us have stumbled upon this phrase somehow in a kind of every development is a live, work, and play development, and still no one knows really what live and work play project is. And I kind of digged a little bit into the history of the term in order to also draw a connection that somehow live, work, and play appears as a kind of a word that is a kind of a spatial product, almost if you wish, that comes to replace the exhausted term of mixed-use development, right, which kind of emerged during late 90s and early 2000s. So it almost feels that real estate advertising language operates on a kind of infrastructural level, building linguistic typologies, which really kind of exists on the level of language, but also translate into the property market logic somehow on the ground. And concretely, Live, Work, and Play was a poem which was developed based on phrases for 34 different real estate developments around the globe. So I don't have a chance actually to show you now how the poem really looks like, but the system of footnotes in a way represents this kind of other kind of mapping actually of this global universalist kind of narrative that we are also somehow faced with. So now I'm going to take a chance and maybe read one more real estate poem. It's called Housing for a Lonely Generation, which was also recently published in the latest issue of Footprint magazine. So it goes. The new way of living is inhabiting time, space, and place that steers inspiration inside of us. Join the global living movement. Find your people. Join us. Imagine a place where you enter as an I, but live as a we. Connect in spaces designed to bring incredible people together. Meet neighbors and make new friends. Be more together. We are allergic to the unoriginal, unbound by convention, opposed to the 9 to 5, inspired by independence, open to adventure, and firm believers that we are only as good as the people with whom we surround ourselves. Network with freelancers, brainstorm with entrepreneurs, share skills and find solutions. Our community might just contain your next friend, lover, or mentor. #WeCommunity. Grab a coffee fix to kickstart your day. Perfect your presentation in a co-working space. Now book the boardroom and nail that pitch. Live it up, stressless. Gather, stretch, steam, caffeinate, co-work, present. Meet, mingle, collaborate. Watch, learn, create. Chop, chat, unwind. It feels like home, maybe even better. This is home. It's your home, your workplace, and your playground. A home to share with friends, teachers, chefs, engineers, artists, and yourself. Stay or live. Take a break and connect with those around you over lunch. Join the wine society in the restaurant for a tasting, then prepare a feast with friends in one of the shared kitchens. Living with passionate, inspiring, positive people who are excited and open to discovering the world. Game-changing convenience in one all-inclusive bill. Hello, we are co-living. We are the world's largest co-living provider. Yes, that's big. Building real estate of the future. Property and software under one roof. The good life. So this is an example of a poem which was, again, built on existing language of 3 corporate co-living platforms, Quarters, The Collective, and We Live. Some of them actually went bankrupt, I learned, after COVID, but some of them are still operational. And again, it's every single word is actually taken from the existing language, which kind of, I think, shows the economic performance also of that language, with corporate co-living platforms also charging very high, very small, let's say small rooms, a few square meters to the inhabitants who kind of also are facing the crisis of home ownership and precarity in many ways. So you could really kind of see the way the company also let's say, imposes a kind of emotional labor also on the users to actually make that community, which becomes economic value, which is then being sold. So somehow, just to kind of quickly wrap up, I think that real estate poetry, in a way, looks into these fictions of global capital, asking, can fiction itself become a tool to unpack somehow these narratives and try to reread them, analyze them, occupy that strange role in a way.
Reframed fiction.
Reframed fiction.
I mean, this is, maybe this brings us back to where you started going before we started reading the poems, but the question of audience. So, I admitted immediately that I was summoned by Live, Work, Play poem when it appeared in my mailbox, right? But I am curious sort of how you think about or speculate about plausible or ideal audiences for this genre. or actual items, right?
You mean,
would you like to read these?
Oh, that's a very
What is
good
the
question.
right place? You know, like it clearly speaks to an academic in the field of architecture, or maybe insofar as I'm a representative of that. But who would we want to read this?
That's a very good question. I mean, one thing, I definitely, when I started with this, I think I was directing this to somehow research environment. And for me, this was a kind of a way to also try to frame a tool of writing, right? So when we work with critical research, there is a particular way of unpacking also the subjects that we deal with. But I think when I started working with real estate poetry, the goal was also to kind of bring completely another kind of reading, another kind of language somehow to the table. But with the question, who could be the audiences that go somehow beyond the academic circles? Well, I think, I mean, one thing that I always somehow wanted to do with real estate poetry was to actually read it next to the physical sites of construction. So I kind of think there would be, this could be one iteration maybe of this project in the future, to kind of then, in the same way as real estate poetry is a displacement of language from a particular environment into environments like this, the next step could be, let's say, the displacement of real estate poetry itself from the academic context into public space, right? So to kind of actually, since advertisements are operating in public space, I mean, there is, I think they operate on kind of two levels in public space, like on one side in the actual physical space of the city, but I think the digital condition also represents very important aspect, the media specificity of this language, because these words are actually written always in English anonymously as digital objects, which are somehow circulating online. And I think this media condition is somehow a very important part of
we're good at hacking things here at MIT. Maybe there's a way to like...
Exactly. Maybe, let's say. But I feel...
Developer website with...
yeah, I think definitely this is, I mean, this project is somehow always changing and it's still under construction, but I think one thing that I would for sure really like to explore further, and hopefully maybe also with a group of students here with whom we are working on a real estate poetry workshop, would be really to ask a question, what does it mean to perform it also publicly, right? So right now these are samples, but what would it mean to publicly really read it somehow, outside of the walls also of the academic space somehow? Yeah.
I mean, I want to maybe, if this is kind of enough on real estate poetry, I want to draw a link from it to the project on, so from real estate fiction to extraction fictions, and that you were examining in the Luxembourg Pavilion, which was at the Arsenal. I don't know if anyone went, you might have seen it. But to sort of talk about lunar labs in general, what are they? Why Luxembourg makes sense or cares about lunar labs, and then your own take on some of these in the pavilion itself.
Yes, so as you mentioned also in the introduction, I just want to give maybe a couple of, let's say, technical mentions before we start. So our project for Luxembourg Pavilion at last year's Venice Architecture Biennale, which was co-curated with my colleague Francelle Kane, was titled Down to Earth, and it looked into the kind of emerging paradigm of space mining, critically examining this emerging paradigm, particularly focusing on the question of resources. So for me, there is a kind of a very clear link also, as you mentioned, somehow move from real estate fictions into resource fictions, and looking also into how, again, language and media really become very concrete, performative, economically performative tools for entire industries to emerge, right? So if in the case of real estate fictions, language was kind of used as a tool to add value, I think in the case of space mining as a kind of industry, language is precisely the only existing domain, actually, that is somehow running this already multi-trillion-dollar industry, which is somehow taking place. So maybe just to quickly start, I think I maybe need to give a couple of also some kind of background, let's say,
Yes.
stories about why space mining and why we decided to choose the topic of space mining to represent Luxembourg Pavilion. So as some of you might know, we are kind of in a very interesting, let's say, moment in which space mining and especially moon mining, right? Asteroid mining, mining of celestial bodies and moon particularly, has kind of returned into public domain, let's say, into a mainstream discourse. And the reason for that is that somehow during last approximately 10 years, there was a very important legal shift that took place around space mining industry. So if 20th century was a kind of a period of space exploration where states and nations were main protagonists of research on moon and asteroids and, as I said, celestial bodies, now this, let's say, there was a kind of shift towards private companies, which are now somehow taking the forefront lead in that sense. It was United States as the first country in the world, and then Luxembourg as second country in the world, which provided legal frameworks for such a shift to take place, which also could be described as a kind of process of space privatization. Normally, based on the treaties, UN treaties, which were published in the 60s and 70s, it is, let's say, semi-legal to mine the moon, right? So these notions of mining were not even defined in the treaties from the 60s and 70s. But the question of resource extraction has been part of imaginaries of many, let's say, nations and then now also companies for a very long time. So this is not a new idea. But to actually allow legally for companies operating on certain national territories to mine the moon, this has been a very recent development. And this is where Luxembourg also plays very important roles. So United States, Luxembourg, Japan, United Arab Emirates were some of the first countries which kind of launched this program, and then are now followed by many more who are kind of coming to that same race.
What does it mean?
So it means particularly, legally, it means that so next to the international law, so there is a treaty, there is international law, and then there is national law, which practically provides the startups and companies registered in that particular state to execute, based on the state, let's say, legal system, to execute extraction from the moon. So let's say in economic terms, it means that the countries who were first in that, let's say, kind of legal process became the most desirable destinations for startups and kind of mining startups and tech startups who are developing technologies in this domain to flock to these territories and open their kind of offices, which then kind of conduct research on this project. So we were looking into this race in a way, right, for extraction and this kind of construction of the new outer planetary mines. So moon has been, of course, in a kind of cultural imaginary of Earth for a very, very long time, and it occupies a very particular cultural space somehow and place, and especially for many different cultures, it means something very different. For one, let's say, kind of set of cultures, it means more. For others, it means less. But somehow, moon has only recently been, in a way, rendered and translated into resource frontiers. So through our project, we wanted to look into that process of construction of resourcefulness, which is also somehow preceded by the process of construction of emptiness, right? So you need to designate a territory as empty, not necessarily only empty of humans, but also empty of meanings, and also empty of histories, and empty of cultural value, in order to construct it as resourceful. And I think this is exactly what space mining industry is somehow doing. So we started from this kind of interesting historical moment, asking how actually does this turn towards space mining and turn towards privatization of space, how does it actually depart from the already extractivist logic of capitalism on the ground?
Does it?
It doesn't, exactly.
Okay.
But what will it do for our understanding of the planetary commons, right? So how does it also, in a way, appear as a greenwashing strategy to the existing crisis of resources on Earth, where instead of addressing resource crisis on Earth by restructuring the way we have access to resources and the way we treat environment and adapt to climate change, we actually just displace the problem elsewhere and somehow target gigantic new outer planetary mine, which will then bring resources back on Earth. So we kind of looked into the space mining project as this interesting industrial take on the very complex, not only material lacks, but also social and political and environmental problems which are embedded in the question of materials, right? So when we started this research, there was one very, for us, very important, curatorially, very important moment in this research. So we were invited to an event which featured gigantic installation of a topology, kind of scientific, let's say, space topology, which we learned that it's called lunar laboratory, right? So it's a kind of a simulation, realistic simulation of lunar surface, which served as a stage for a competition of mining technologies. So robots, rovers, competing, running, stumbling, falling, people jumping in to help them. And they were kind of, digging from these simulated craters. It was a kind of actually a scientific event, but absolute theater performance in which we just arrived out of nowhere, and then we were absolutely absorbed by this kind of duality of what lunar laboratory does. Mm-hmm. So on one side serves as a kind of technical space where technologies are being tested, but on the other side serves as a very important media space in which imagery of this heroic new technology is being produced, because we are still not mining the moon, right? So space mining is a project that is out there exactly, it's a promise somehow of industrial promise of the future, but this future is very uncertain, and it might happen in 30 years or 50 years or never, right? So practically the entire industry is also highly dependent, its investment sector is highly dependent on this imagery and imaginary. This is also what we mentioned a couple of days ago. Anand Singh beautifully wrote about this. Mm-hmm. You have to imagine profit first in order to obtain it. And I think practically the construction of this media world around space mining is the actual and only moon, right? So lunar laboratories are these kind of mediations of the moon that we are somehow dealing with. So what we decided to do curatorially in our project, we actually started from this lunar laboratory, from this kind of space of ultimate realism and simulation. And we turned our pavilion into one such lunar lab, and then instead of using it as a set for the kind of performance of mining and mining technologies and tech products, we did the opposite. So we featured elements of research which unpacked the backstages in a way of the space mining industry. So we kind of use this stage in order to unveil its backstages. So this is kind of led to actually the production of 3 pieces somehow curatorially. The first one was a film developed by Armin Linke in collaboration with Francel and me, which was based on a lot of interviews that we conducted together in Luxembourg, archival footage that Armin found, remote sensing videos of the robots and rovers. So also looking into the way the technology itself perceives this kind of simulation of the moon. And the video, in a way, the film is called Cosmic Market, and it looks into the historical continuity of ideas of these extraction imaginaries, right? Kind of running back to the last 60 years. So I have a kind of a short film.
Earth first, right?
Exactly, okay. Of Earth first, but also of the moon, even kind of from the Soviet era moment. So I have a short video excerpt I'm going to play, and then we can see.
At the moment, speaking about difficult things, another difficult thing is to establish the market on the moon. Many people ask, okay, so you're going to mine on the moon, but who's going to be your customer, right? And at the moment, because we are in this industry, in this area, we know that the first market on the moon will be water ice, hydrogen, oxygen, and mainly oxygen. Because if we think about rocket propellant, a big part of it is actually oxygen and hydrogen. So we know that we need to find big deposits of oxygen, for instance, oxygen minerals like oxides, and there's a big interest in finding and characterizing the water ice deposits in the South Pole. So there's many things that need to be done across the value chain. And in the value chain of mining, we start with exploration, then infrastructure, then you have your ISRU operation, which is extraction or mining, processing, refining, storage, and then the transportation of your product to your customer, right? And across the value chain, at the moment, we are on exploration, and we are developing exploration technology.
Весь процесс выполнения этих работ продолжался в течение 1,5 часов. За это время с Земли на станцию было подано свыше 200 радиокоманд. Грунт взят. Миллиарды лет он был частицей Луны, а теперь, заключенный в капсулу возвращаемого аппарата, отправиться на далекую Землю.
I have two lowball questions for you.
Okay.
One is,
Непрерывно работают наземные
so
измерительные
you
и
said in some
вычислительные
official
средства.
description of the project that this project goes beyond the present Anthropocene optics. And I've been trying to sort of think about, or I'm intrigued by this notion of beyond Anthropocene or Anthropocenic optics. Is this beyond something we can think of on the planetary scale as a kind of, leaving or taking the neoliberal capitalist imaginary on the road to the moon and other celestial bodies, and then, or as an ironic beyond, or both? In a way, you started saying this, but I was really captured by this notion of the project deals with or operates on this kind of optics that are not Anthropocene or beyond Anthropocene.
Thank you so much for this question. Maybe I will just say two more words about two more elements that we are seeing, and I want to return to that because I think that was somehow the core also of the exhibition. So next to the film, we also worked, this is a project which was a collaboration with the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, a workshop called How to Mind the Moon, co-curated with Francel, Lev Bratishenko, and myself, with participation of 5 invited researchers, Jane Manhattan, Anastasia Kubrak, Ameline Eng, Bethany Rigby, and Fred Sharman, who were looking into the format of material library, right? So kind of also distorting in a way the notion of neutrality of material science. So working with the kind of a concept of material data sheet, looking into, for instance, I don't know, if we talk about material resistance, for example, in mechanical or chemical sense, it means resistance to the chemical, let's say, change or mechanical pressure. But what would happen if we talk about the political resistance of the material? So we kind of try to work across different scales in a way, looking into the history of material imaginaries, looking into the, let's say, technical domain of the resource themselves, and then also, I just want to mention and then come back to your question, and also through the publication, looking into, on one side, the legal history that I just mentioned, the role of media, but also the history of the construction of the resource frontier itself. And now to also answer, what does looking beyond the optics of the Anthropocene meant for us? This was extremely crucial, let's say, element of the whole project. And I would say, for us, it meant challenging the gaze itself, right? So I think what our exhibition effectively tried to do was to provide a kind of a set of lenses to challenge the way of looking at the moon. So we asked ourselves, of course, I mean, critically, it's very easy to criticize, of course, the industrial narrative around resources, right? So this was somehow, I mean, not easy, but let's say it's essential to start from there and to kind of challenge this construction of resourcefulness. But then we asked also, if we don't think about the moon as resourceful, should we think about the moon as a form of planetary commons? But then when we talk about commons, we still talk about Anthropocene, right? So we still talk about another way of distributing the resources. I mean, the idea of commons itself is organized around just management and governance around resources. So we also try to look into what would it mean if we would go even a step beyond and not even try to look at the moon as a form of planetary commons, but to look at the moon as a comrade. And I know you also draw a lot of inspiration from the work of Jodi Dean, yes, but also in our case, also the work of Oksana Timofeeva in her book Solar Politics, which was extremely influential for our research, where she kind of outlines the sun through the perspective of comradeship. And what did it mean? It actually meant, in our case, to kind of understand the moon as someone or something or something else, right? That actually joins us in the same struggle against capitalist extraction. So to kind of put Earth and the moon in a kind of a constellation of something that you could describe as a cosmic solidarity, which actually underlines, in a way, the position of Earth with the moon through the perspective of extraction. So to come back to your question, I think the challenging the looking beyond actually was directed to kind of challenging the way we look, actually, the way we perceive. So, yeah.
I mean, now the next lowball question will seem maybe silly, but it's I'm repeating it from someone who interviewed you, who seemed pretty well disposed towards the project, but then they ask something along the lines of, why research this when there are other arguably more pressing problems? And this interviewer says, those are sustainability, social equity, and economic development. It's very hard to ask this after a cosmic solidarity, but maybe, you can, maybe this is really kind of pointing us to a bigger question, sort of, maybe to a question about what is general in this worldview and research, or what is kind of, research obviously happens at the kind of intersection of capitalism, the built environment, imaginaries, or resources and language in some way. And are there tools maybe that we can extract from this that you take with you from one topic to another, a planet to another, or like something that is that we can extract and make applicable to a kind of problem?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I mean, maybe to start with, I think I always, also when I talk about this project, I always like to somehow underline, to come back to the title of the exhibition, which was Down to Earth. And I think when we decided to choose the moon as our case study, I think we were effectively talking about Earth, right? So we were using these distant lenses, which actually moon occupies as a kind of, everyone knows the moon, right? So this is something that is extremely, our relationship with the moon spans really all these scales that kind of lie in between. It can get, it's a very personal relationship, an intimate relationship to the one that kind of shapes entire communities, let's say, and to also the planetary one, right? So we all do have an affiliation with the moon, and no one is absolutely ignorant to that question. So I think for us, moon served as a kind of interesting entry point to actually look into the question of Earth, right? So on one side, what I mentioned, the way this industry really operates is by kind of perpetuating further the existing logic of extraction and status quo, let's say kind of political status quo that is here. But also looking at the moon also means looking into not something that is intangible or romantic or fictional, but something that is, in the case of space mining, backed up by extremely concrete, tangible industry. Mining industry, which is simply outlining a kind of a new frontier which also is a very big economic project. So for us...
But let me sort of try, maybe I offer you something and you can, throw it out if it doesn't work. But as you were describing the material resistance and the politics of material resistance or politics of resistance of materials, that felt a little bit for a moment the way that real estate poetry seems to operate. Like in both cases, it feels like there's a kind of demythologizing and complicating that's going on in the projects themselves. And so for me, if I think about what is general about these projects or what is kind of continuous about them in the way that I could say, when you start going in your, and maybe we can talk about whether or not a kind of particular expat linguistic nomadism is part of this. But when you start going from one set of questions to another, what are the tools you bring? It feels like that sort of ethos, at least, of demythologizing, and then that finds its logics or its tools that are particular to the situation kind of to operate.
Yeah. No, I think, I accept the proposal. Okay. No, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, effectively, I want to boil it down also to something extremely technical. I mean, to connect more clearly also to the work of real estate poetry. In the end, when I started looking at the space mining project, I mean, first, of course, we looked into not first, but among other things, we read the laws and the treaties and looked into many different kinds of documentation. But we also read so many real estate fictions, actually, right? So it's, again, the moment of reading and listening to the language and the way language and the media becomes instrumental. And I think definitely, I think it kind of means somehow building the tools through which you can, in the end, kind of unpack something that might seem too big or too immaterial or too intangible to tackle in the end of the day. I think when you start boiling it down to the sites of production, where actually this production takes place, you kind of realize that there is a certain pattern thinking also, which kind of cuts across all these projects, which rely a lot also on attention somehow, right, on the construction of imaginaries. And I think space mining is also one such endeavor, together with the real estate property speculation, for instance. Yeah.
Should we go to the Great Repair?
We can move to the Great Repair.
So, I thought that this would be a kind of the good last chapter, and we're actually approaching 10 to 6. It's a little faster than I thought. But the Great Repair was, in a way, produced between a series of different institutions. It opened in Berlin in October and closed in January, and now has another showing in Paris. And for me, repair has been a big kind of topic, and some of the people in this room know this. And though I think the word itself is getting rapidly tired, maybe a bit the way care is also, I think that the disciplinary shift under the rubric of repair is so big and necessary and basically multifaceted that we have to talk about it. But so maybe the first question is sort of, or as you begin explaining the project to us, sort of what is the use of that term or that rubric in the project?
So the Great Repair project, as you said, was a collaborative project between several institutions. There, Arc Plus, which is a kind of a journal, but also a kind of a research and curatorial platform based in Berlin, Akademie der Künste in Berlin, Department of Architecture, particularly Chair of Architecture of Territory by Milica Topalovic at ETH Zurich, and our Master in Architecture program in Luxembourg. And the project started, I think, now already 2 years ago or even more. And it was launched with the first issue that we see here on the left, The Great Repair Politics for a Repair Society, which was published in December 2022. And then the project was also followed by an exhibition, as you mentioned, which opened in Berlin in last October, and also opened yesterday, concretely, in Paris. So I heard it went very well. Kind of sorry to miss it also. So the project, I was part of an extended, in a sense, curatorial team working together with Florian Hertweg, Christian Hiller, Markus Krieger, Alex Nema, Ann Lingo, Milica Topalovic, and Nazli Tumerdem. So Nazli Tumerdem and me, we were kind of more associate curators in the larger group of curatorial team. And the exhibition, in a way, looked into, it asked the question, how can repair, in a way, become a new design paradigm? So it looked into the politics and aesthetics of repair practice, gathering the work of more than 40 artists, landscape architects, researchers, collectives, groups operating in many, many different forms. I know I don't have the time to list literally everyone, but maybe I will just give some names that might sound familiar to you. So the work of Assemble, the work of Kader Attia, Atelier Bow Wow, Santiago del Hierro with Inga, people of Colombia, Anna Heringer, Katrin Dorfler, Charlotte Malterebart, Lakatum Vazal, Mirle Laderman Ukeles, whose work was curated by Bettina Knaup, Sakia, Marijetica Potrč, Mio Tsuneyama, Paulo Tavares, and also Collective Architecture Studio from MIT, which was also part of the project, and many, many other artists. So we somehow tried to tackle different, let's say, questions which this very complex notion of repair really brings. So spanning from the questions such as care work and maintenance to the questions of reappropriation, knowledge decolonization, thinking about other production of epistemologies of knowledge, thinking about the tools of repair and also who has access to the tools of repair, thinking about the repair of the discipline itself, so not just the objects, but also the way we construct also professional subjectivities, just to name some, the questions of sufficiency, durability, etc. And in a way, the curatorial, sorry, I forgot to kind of guide you through some slides. So the curatorial, let's say, approach to the exhibition was organized around this notion of repair as a form of practice. So we kind of took the notion of workshop and practice as a kind of central element to organize this large group of contributors across also very vast and extremely interesting space of Academie der Künste, like over 2,000 square meters. We tried to really overlap the work of the contributors, not as exhibition of static objects which sit in space, but also as a kind of exhibition which was accompanied by the School of Repair, where also the artists and the contributors could become part of their work and also sharing their work as a form of tools to the public. So to also answer your question, I think the whole exhibition was really aimed at kind of, let's say, assembling together all these tools, sometimes spanning from very concrete examples of material work, really, with biomaterials to make it very, very pragmatic, to let's say, different pedagogical tools for challenging kind of power hierarchies in the classroom, to tools of different kinds of mapping and viewing the territory. So really spanning across every possible way of working across the word of repair. And this is also how the exhibition started. So we really started from the building itself, looking into, first of all, navigating the flow of audience, not through the central staircases, which are very representative and kind of lead directly to the exhibition space. But what we did instead, we asked the audience to go through the backstage of ADK and to pass through, I see some kind of connections and thoughts around this, to pass through the actual infrastructural spaces of the building, looking through this kind of moment of walking, looking into the history of maintenance. So the history of renovation of the building, which was done also by Brenne architects before that, but also the work of the maintenance and care workers who are actually running that space. So, for instance, the photographer Zara Pfeiffer was commissioned to work with the company who actually is maintaining the building itself. So she produced photo essay, a visual kind of essay, documenting the rituals and the processes of this invisible work of the company, who is not only maintaining the building of ADK, but also many other buildings in Berlin, but still somehow their work goes under the radar in a way. And then she looked into the practices of the work they are doing every day to actually run that space. I mean, I don't know how much time I have, but I would just maybe like to very, very briefly guide you to just some of the projects. Here on the right, we see very interesting work by Fuminori no Saku and Mio Tsuneyama. I mean, I don't want to single out any projects. I'm just trying to kind of make a picture around the exhibition, which was called Holes in the House, and which kind of looks into the kind of rising vacancy of spaces in Tokyo and obsolescence of buildings which are demolished after a 30-year cycle. So what they did, they kind of looked into the repair of one such building through the notion of embodied repair, so slow repair that takes place over a long period of time. This is also where I think the notion of repair comes in contrast to the notion of fix, right? So it's not about growth-oriented.
Yeah, I did think, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to just mention for me that was fascinating is, or that, you know, upon reflection afterwards I thought was really important in the exhibition, is a kind of kinship between artistic practice and architectural practice. Architectural practice goes from, you know, drawing up the kind of, and collecting some of the kind of questions of repair to absolute building technology kind of stuff that was in there. But that kinship between art and architecture, I feel, was very important in shifting the kind of, and recoding breakage from a problem to solve towards a kind of an ethos across all of the whole body of work.
Yeah, I think so too, because also when you think, I mean, the question of repair cannot be also reduced to the question of discipline, right? So I think this is a kind of example really of transversal issue, right? So to talk about care, to talk about repair, we cannot situate these questions only in the tool of architectural knowledge, right? So we have to also look beyond the disciplinary boundaries, I think. And so, for example, there was a project, Holes in the House, which, for instance, was this one example of very material kind of work, but also a kind of a way to challenge the notion of before and after, right? So we repair and then, you know, we fix and then there is something new, right? Something that is fixed. What happens when you start living repair, when repair becomes kind of a form of embodied everyday practice of inhabiting space? The work of Marija Potrč, which we see kind of further in space, who looked into the questions of right of rivers and, let's say, kind of environmental personhood and the question of, let's say, protection of subjects of nature in a way.
Kind of legal status.
Exactly, both legal status and practices of communities in protecting somehow their own environments and heritage, to the work of chair of Milica Topalović with the model in the front that looked into the energy landscapes and also asked the question of the tools, who has access to the tools and who has access to the power, meaning also not just the power, but also the power, electrical power and energy. To many.
The background is Sakia and Nida's.
The background, Sakia's.
Nida Sinokrot.
Sakia, no, this is
a faculty at.
Sorry.
Faculty at MIT, Nida Sinokrot.
Yes, they have a piece in this room, which looked into the drew inspiration of the audio piece they developed, drew inspiration from the scarecrows in the space of Palestine, and also the kind of the political dimension of farming and scarecrows, which was a kind of very interesting audio installation that really operated beautifully in that space. To to many, many different issues, right? So here we also see the work of Paulo Tavares in the back, Manuel Hertz, and his work on Babin Yar synagogue, many interesting projects. And here we are coming to the third room, which kind of tackled the question of disciplinary repair. And I think this one, particularly for me, was, I think, very important to really look into how we as architects understand the notion of repair not only towards the external, to the material object or to the external environment, but also to the discipline itself. So how can we also use this term to challenge somehow the hierarchies which are operational in the way we teach, in the way we work in offices or other environments, on the level of the construction site. So here, this room featured one spectacular project called Balls for All, developed by a collective architecture studio at MIT. So some of you might recognize a kind of a commoning device that draws inspiration from the project of Yugoslav self-management. I don't want to speak about the project. I think you can say way more. But also many other contributions, like, for instance, the contribution by Charlotte Maltere-Barth and her proposal for a speculative call for a moratorium on new construction, where she asks what would, it's a very speculative question that asks what would happen if we would challenge the paradigm of building always new, but actually work towards redistributing also what is already there in a way to other projects. I think in the distance we see the project of my students from University of Luxembourg who mapped Berlin parking spaces and looked into the post-fossil heritage and realized that actually once you map all the big parking lots in Berlin, you kind of create a space of a new city in the city. So kind of asking a question, how can we in the post-fossil kind of, let's say, imaginary, how can we use this already sealed land, for instance, to rethink the question of housing, for example, accessibility and housing justice and so on. So many, many projects. I mean, I really don't probably have the time to continue, but it would require, I guess, another 2 or 3 hours. I don't know if we are ready for that. But I'm happy to also answer some questions about this. Yes, so
I mean, we can very soon maybe open towards questions, but I have one that maybe crosses across these projects. Both of these are, in a way, curatorial works, the last two, and maybe, as you suggested, the poetry is also in some way. And in both of these cases, there were many voices involved, or ultimately speaking. And so for someone who thinks of the way architecture courses through the media complex, usually orchestrated on behalf of capital, how do you think of exhibitions traveling and contributing to that same complex?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm not sure.
Exhibitions.
Exhibitions.
What is their sort of efficacy in the in the context of all of the things that you are able to describe for us as complexities through which architecture travels?
I think I would say that exhibition work and curatorial work for me really is about providing not a kind of a fixed set of statements and facts, but rather a set of tools that we can bring with us somewhere and use to, find another way of looking at the world around us. So what cuts across all the works that I very often ask myself this question. So, I mean, also as time goes by, you kind of start working on projects which are becoming kind of, departing from the initial project that you really started from. But what I realize also that really cuts across all the work that I try to do is, in a way, working with these kind of invisible economic and political mechanisms that in the end shape the environment and shape this environment through many different steps and many different processes in between. One of them, very important for me, is also the construction of imaginaries, right? So I really try to work also with my students across different media and across different scales. And I think that's also the work of the curator, to really kind of use research-based kind of investigation to not, let's say, provide a a set of ready-made solutions and kind of factual information only, but rather to provide a kind of a toolkit that anyone can, in a way, take. And tool is also not a finished work itself, right? So tool is a kind of a question. I think the hardest part is to really ask the right question somehow through the exhibition. No? So I think exhibitions, the role of exhibition for me is to kind of find a way to formulate a question and to outline tools that can also be changed and that can also be kind of readapted, kind of a device that we can use to unpack somehow.
I mean, I certainly like that description of curatorial work and align with it. But my existential question is the one that I sort of asked you just a second ago, the one that basically in the context of communicative capitalism, in which, you know, communication and language are, and messages are, in fact, part of the kind of capitalist machine, right? They are where subjectivities are built, sold, and traded. What we do as curators feels a lot like it too. So sort of how do we navigate that line of you know, producing effects we want in the context that is not totally in our control, right? And that already uses those logics to other ends.
That is definitely a very existential question.
Yes, it is.
I don't know if I can answer it. I mean, I completely understand what you mean. I guess there is not a single answer to it, but I think one that we certainly always need to ask ourselves is also to look into somehow the exhibition itself as a site, right? So, and ask ourselves who has an access to it, which kind of publics do we want to both work with, but we also want to construct also through the work, right? So help shape, give space to, give the stage to, and address in a way. So I think in that sense that curatorial work is also something that works precisely around that notion of the public and the publics which are somehow involved, right? And I definitely think that there is a lot of questions to be tackled in that sense in the curatorial work. I mean, just Biennale is always the one, right, we can start from. I mean, the entire notion of national representation, for example, at Biennale is already itself a very problematic starting point to speak from, no? Like, I think it kind of assumes certain political power system that you somehow also want to challenge, I think, through the work we are doing. And I think, of course, there are many different approaches to that. We try to also look kind of critically. Like
somehow you convinced the Luxembourg Cultural Commission that
yes.
You ought to be critical of the mining industry on that platform.
Yeah. So in that sense, I think there is, I think one has to be, as a curator, one has to be conscious not only about the content of the work that is being produced, but also about the entire set of industries, unfortunately including the one of the artistic production as well, very often, and to critically tackle it as part of the tackling of the topic itself. So I think that kind of comes, this embodied critique has to always be there, right? So
I mean, I think we kind of circle back to precision, humanity, and generosity of the platform in some way, right? What do we do with it?
Yeah.
But maybe, so unless you have questions to me, maybe this is a good moment to also open up to questions from the audience if you have any. Hi, Nicholas.
Hey, that was really wonderful and a great example of a great series of talks here. I actually just wanted to follow up on Anna's last question, because I really enjoyed each of the projects, but I also enjoyed thinking about their connections. And the last question kind of related them in as it relates to images and the production and consumption of images, which is a lot of what we as architects do. And as I tried to think about the different connections between the word poems and the space mining and the repair things, I was struck by the fact that even though what I really appreciate about the poems is that they evoke very simply on the page, a kind of aesthetic operation that is in play in the advertising itself, which is to say that something which is kind of collective and shared, the city, quintessentially a city like Belgrade, is kind of parceled out and consumed in these small pieces of property and turned into a product, that is a kind of in which words like love and live, play become kind of sold as kind of in the poems there, the words are kind of stand-ins for the images and for the occupation as a kind of diagram as the aesthetic operation. In the mining, there's a very related operation in the mining component, which goes back to, I would say, very early notions of the creation of the idea of wilderness in this society in particular, which is to say that something, a landscape which is collective and actually occupied, often by, in the case of the United States, by indigenous populations, is emptied in order to be ostensibly an aesthetic subject. So, a shared, to occupy a shared gaze, but then as an empty object, what goes on behind that gaze on Earth, and I would say the notion of the both the law of kind of wilderness and the operations of wilderness are so identical off-world as to be kind of actually the same thing. We shouldn't think of them as differently. It's being emptied out and aestheticized in order for it to be kind of literally mined from the other side. So this is true of the now of the bottom of our oceans, and again of these traditional landscapes. And then in the last piece, I'm getting to the question, but I'm just trying to think it through as I'm asking it. There's a kind of, in this notion of kind of, the notion of repair is explicitly anti-traditional mode of practice, traditionally anti the idea of a consumption of an image that makes you want to build something. And so it is often expressed also through a kind of anti-aesthetics of like, we will hold back from you a kind of strict image, and some of the beautiful photographs in your exhibit are kind of played on that. So is that, I guess if there is a question in these, it'd be lovely just to hear you just speak in any way you want to the kind of aesthetic operations you're talking about as a connected piece. And then if there's another explicit question is in the kind of repair piece, do we have to accept an anti-aesthetics in the depiction of repair? Or how do we handle that? Does its maneuver on the kind of aesthetic operations of consumption have to be diagrammatically opposed?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I mean, also for the reading of all the projects together, I think it kind of also helps me, to understand also always these lines of connection. To come directly to your question, I think, so I think a couple of months ago, I was having a drink with a friend in Luxembourg, and then she said, we were talking about repair, and she said something very simple, very obvious, and kind of stuck with me, I think. She said that somehow we just think of architecture as beautiful, controlled environments, usually of concrete, glass, and sometimes wood, and like controlled materials which are put somehow in order. But to start thinking about the politics of repair, somehow we need to start thinking of the aesthetics of the patched, of the unfinished, of something that is in a perpetual kind of continuous mode of being made. And I think these notions of aesthetics and politics really come absolutely inseparable, and for architects who really operate a lot also on the visual aspect, right, where somehow representation of kind of images and politics of representation are crucial. I think this is also a very important field to start with. For me, I just want to use one example. So now I don't know if I can show some other images, but maybe it can be checked separately. So for example, the work of Fuminori no Saku and Mio Tsuneyama in Holes in the House. Mio Tsuneyama also gave a lecture kind of elaborating also on the modes of representation actually for their project as part of a lecture series in Luxembourg that we hosted last semester. So she showed images which kind of, these are very messy sections of a house, right? So not just the space itself, which is a kind of in a perpetual mode of repair, but also the way you would choose to show that repair paradigm through architectural drawing itself. I think it becomes super interesting, question. How do we represent it, right? So because traditional ways of representing architecture somehow do show kind of given conditions, right? They are not made to show also this perpetuality and also all the backstage kind of work. So they produced a really wonderful set of very, I mean, if I'm allowed to say, that's my interpretation, kind of messy images, messy sections which overlap infrastructural maps and infrastructural drawings of electric grid, for example, in the house, or the pipes, or kind of infrastructure of the house, with the process of showing the process of inhabiting and repair. I think for me this project was kind of extremely interesting example, which did not run across only the practice and even kind of, let's say, the politics of approach itself, but also the politics of representation very clearly. So I don't have here a ready-made image to show, but you can also find it in the catalog of the exhibition. Anywhere, I think, where you look for their work, you would be able to see this reference that I have in mind. And I think it was very striking somehow the level of overlaying the information that would not usually find its logical place somehow in the existing, let's say, methodology of representation that we are having. So I think this question of representation is extremely crucial, and I think it cannot be, yeah.
For me, you know, like, I do think that this exhibition trafficked in the kind of aesthetics of messy repair in terms of the exhibition itself.
Yeah.
But it allowed pieces to be in it that had very different aesthetics amongst them, right? So not everything was equally messy or equally precise, but there were some things that were of a different kind of language. I do think that we also, in expanding the field to include questions of repair, we are including more actors, more time, and we don't yet have the tools by which we govern the representation of those in our field. It might yet become all kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
So.
Exactly. Yeah, thanks for the question.
To in part follow on Nicholas's point, in the real estate poetry, obviously the words of real estate come with a certain architecture. I wonder, in your exploration of that language, if you learned something new about the architecture that came with it.
I thank you also for a great question. I learned several things. One, for example, maybe the most important one for me was to also kind of unexpected one maybe was to realize that a lot of terms that we readily somehow accept as urban or architectural typologies operate even more on the level of language than actually somehow physically. So live, work, and play developments were just one example. I would say even the notion of smart cities, right? So I think the notion of smartness, for example, as a kind of added value is also constructed somehow through the way of narrating, right? So it's a kind of there is even a great essay, Smart Cities as a Storytelling Project. So I think for me, one thing that I could take is on one side this really the kind of the power of this industry to construct entire urban typologies that operate on the level of language. On another side, I think I learned a lot about specialization of labor in architecture itself, and also the emergence of the industry of real estate media, let's say, strategies, or real estate kind of, I don't know, media design. I don't even know how to word it. I learned that somehow the traditional separation of the roles between architects and urban planners and those who are also commissioned to develop media presence of the objects that we build and design has to be also rethought. And when I say rethought, I am not speaking from a kind of nostalgic position in which I say now architects lost their old power in, you know, like being the only signatories of the projects, right? I think we are in a condition in which these blurry kind of, you know, processes are taking place. And I think as architects, we need to find a way to first acknowledge also these transitions, but then also to find a way to operate to also take this context to rethink the politics also of the discipline and the role of the architect itself. So I think that was one, maybe that was, this question was cutting the question of knowledge, let's say, and the question of expertise and labor was more present in the doctoral research part of my dissertation. So poetry was not part of my doctoral dissertation. It was a separate project that was kind of running next to it, really focusing on the level of language. So I think there were several lines really of kind of coming back also to the physical reality somehow of architects. And I think it reminded me really that somehow I think I mentioned this in the beginning of the presentation. One question that I'm constantly also asking myself, and also in the way I teach and work with the students, would be really how to even develop design strategies and design pedagogies in real estate media complex, in which somehow architecture cannot be separated anymore from property speculation on one side, something that we already know, I would say, but also media infrastructures on the other, which are coupled also in such an inseparable way with property speculation. So I think it kind of takes us to the level of complexity that I feel we also need to bring back maybe in the way we talk about pedagogy and research methods. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, but just some thoughts on this matter.
Thank you so much. This is a really fascinating conversation. And it almost seems like we're making a very unconscious distinction about real estate and architecture. We're kind of implying that architecture is a good type of media storytelling and strategy versus real estate, which we've kind of vilified under this realm of capitalism. So first part of that is, how do we as architects who have a media strategy, who sell images, who kind of employ the same tools as real estate, know that we're outside that realm of what we're selling and not selling. And then I think a second thing that came to mind is we're talking about storytelling, which is almost a really human experience. So how do you differentiate between bad storytelling and good storytelling?
That's a very, very good question. I mean, I completely agree that this seems like a false separation. I mean, architecture in the context in which we are operating is just absolutely commodified. I mean, when we talk about housing, I think we very rarely talk about housing beyond the premises of commodification. So I would certainly not draw a line and not romanticize architectural production beyond its actually reality of real estate markets. So, but I think it doesn't mean that we should only also embrace that condition. So I think that's also where storytelling comes to play. I think it can also be used as a very efficient way of rethinking these property relations and property paradigm that we also very often take for granted and take as given. There is work of a really fantastic writer. She's a legal scholar. Her name is Carol Rose. And she wrote this essay that I just mentioned. It's called Property as Storytelling, where she asked, I very often cite this paragraph where she asked, how come that politicians and economists who have throughout history shaped our understanding of property relied way often on storytelling techniques, on telling stories, than on factual or data-based kind of argumentation. And then she kind of goes on and says, because property is a story, actually. It's a story of how things got to be that way, and they did not have to wind up the way they did wind. I'm kind of paraphrasing now this, let's say, paragraph, but I think this wording by Carol Rose I find extremely inspiring. And if we start to look into the role of stories, the role of language, the role of media, right, the role of all these different ways of thinking and mechanisms of distribution of these words and meanings, you suddenly could also come to a point, can we, use storytelling to also tell other kinds of stories of property, or even undo it altogether, right? So I think if you start somehow from that premise that our understanding of private ownership and the way, which really appears as an unchallenged paradigm, through which housing operates and through which cities are produced, if we suddenly take this kind of slightly absurd, question and we say it's just a story, it's not a fact, it's not data. Economy is not a rational science. It's really a form of fiction, in a way, which kind of uses data as a kind of important tool. Then I think then storytelling and telling the stories and also realizing and challenging who the narrator is also becomes very important. And I think I'm definitely not the one who thinks that only telling different stories can, help decommodify our cities. I think this fight has to really happen on many, many different fronts. But I think in kind of building the way we talk about things, and we are also building the way we see them, and therefore the way we engage with them and the way we do things in the end. So in that sense, I kind of link back storytelling as this very essential tool in a way, right, in kind of challenging these worldviews.
This is a perfect ending.
Okay.
I mean, thank you for basically, all last semester in positions we talked about, or at least occasionally, we talked about how do we shift the imaginary. The imaginary has power, it's productive. It's a series of narratives, and I feel like you gave us a few tools to begin or to do something, to chip at it. Thank you very much, Marija, and thank you everyone for spending the evening with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.